Hello, my friends. Hi, everyone. I want to talk about Ukraine and reality. But before I get there, I want to address what's happening in Venezuela and in our own military and foreign policy. The United States does not tolerate left leaning governments, either in South America or Central America. As soon as Washington sees a government that it thinks is considerably to the left of center, it moves in to replace that government. We have a rich history of doing this, and ever since Chavez won in Venezuela, the United States has had its gun sights on that country. Nothing has changed. We want to get rid of Maduro, and we would prefer to put in place a right wing government. If you have any doubts about this, just look at our relationship with Cuba since 1959 when Fidel Castro took over. We've had our gun sights on Cuba ever since. We cannot stand the fact that Cuba has a government that is to the left of center. Uh, Cuba doesn't pose any national security threat to the United States today. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a long time ago. Venezuela, in my view, does not pose a threat to the United States either. There are, however, many people who see it as an ideological threat. They believe that we're in such a precarious position in the Western Hemisphere and maybe around the world that if there is a left wing government here, even one that is not coordinating with a distant great power, the mere fact that it exists is categorically unacceptable. So we go after it hammer and tongs almost every time. The people of a country may democratically choose their leaders, like Lula in Brazil, a hard left guy in a prosperous country with a major economic base, or a government in Venezuela, which is not prosperous, but potentially so, and yet we're prepared to use force or covert means to change their government. It sounds like Afghanistan, doesn't it? We do not really believe in sovereignty. The United States thinks it has the right, the responsibility, and the capability to intervene in the domestic politics of every country on the planet when it sees fit. This is how we operate. It's a gross violation of the UN Charter, and everybody understands that constant violations of sovereignty make for a much less peaceful world. But that doesn't matter to us because we're interested in remaking the world in our own image. I'm very familiar with the military world, its discipline, and respect for authority. Militaries are giant killing machines. If you're trained in the US Army, Air Force, Navy, or Marines, in most jobs you are fundamentally trained to kill people. That's what militaries do. Given that militaries are trained to kill, and there is always a powerful tendency to engage in wanton violence, you need a set of rules that are drilled into everybody's head so that people think twice before they engage in murderous behavior. I'm not talking about normal combat. I'm talking about killing civilians, killing prisoners of war, and so forth. It is very hard when militaries are engaged in combat to keep a lid on things because there is that powerful tendency to do unlawful things. So we have laws of war, we drill them into people, and everyone understands what those laws are. The whole system is designed to keep warfare as humane as possible. But there is a dangerous countercurrent of people who say that when you get into combat, you can do pretty much anything you want. If you want to carry out a My Lai type massacre, you just go out and do it. Of course, that's precisely what we want to prevent, which is why we insist on rules about what kind of killing is legitimate in war and what kind is not. It is absolutely clear that no one is obliged to obey an unlawful order. If a president ordered the U.S. military to kill unarmed civilians, not engaged in violence on their speedboats in the Caribbean because he thinks they're drug dealers, that would be unlawful. British military intelligence, MI6, understands this, which is why they refuse to cooperate with us in certain operations in the Caribbean. They know this is unlawful, murderous behavior. A president can claim he has some sort of written mandate to do it, but virtually no one outside his inner circle and fervent supporters believes that makes it legitimate. There has even been a public message from members of Congress, many of them former military or former CIA, speaking directly to members of the military and the intelligence community. They remind those in uniform that they swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, that threats to the Constitution can come from within, not just from abroad, and that our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders. You must refuse illegal orders, and no one is obliged to carry out commands that violate the law or the Constitution. That message is, at its core, free political speech and an accurate statement of the law. Some people argue this will cause disruption in the ranks, that individual soldiers can't decide for themselves whether an order is lawful. But history and Nuremberg teach us that I was just following orders is not a valid excuse for killing or harming nonviolent and innocent people. The fear that there will be thousands of illegal order disputes every week is exaggerated. In reality, only occasionally will an order be clearly illegal. In those rare cases, people can and should question it. A commander can then explain the context if there's a legitimate justification. But we certainly do not want a situation in which people down the chain of command must obey an order they themselves recognize as clearly illegal. If you are at a modern-day My Lai and someone tells you to massacre civilians, you do not want a system that demands you do it axiomatically. When critics say that telling soldiers they can refuse illegal orders is wildly inappropriate or dangerous, they misrepresent the issue. This is not about disobeying orders in general. It is about disobeying illegal orders. The real question is simple. Should service members obey unlawful commands or should they refuse them? The law, history, and basic morality say they must refuse. Now, let me turn back to Ukraine and reality. If Ukraine is on its last leg, as many of us believe, and if the Russian military is very close to achieving the Kremlin's goals, the obvious question is, why would the Kremlin entertain peace negotiations now? The answer is that from Moscow's perspective, it looks as though they are going to get everything they want in any negotiations anyway. This war is being won on the battlefield by the Russians, and the Americans recognize this. As a consequence, the United States is now willing to cave to almost all of Russia's demands, as best we can tell from what we read about the draft plan. Whether Ukrainians and Europeans ultimately cave is another matter, but Washington is facing up to reality. Ukraine is running out of manpower and ammunition. The United States is no longer funding Ukraine at previous levels. The Europeans cannot come up with enough cash. There's a major corruption crisis that undermines Zelensky's standing in Kyiv. And Russian aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones are systematically destroying infrastructure in Ukraine. Given all of those factors, the writing is on the wall. Now is the time, from Washington's perspective, to cut a deal. They are willing to support a deal that gives the Russians pretty much everything they want. But can a deeply corrupt and politically vulnerable President Zelensky enter into an agreement that peacefully cedes territory to Russia without exposing himself to elimination by the hardcore Banderist nationalists around him? More generally, it's hard to imagine anyone in Ukraine publicly accepting such terms. Ukraine would have to give up large amounts of territory, cut the size of its military roughly in half, accept limitations on deploying certain weapons that could hit Russia, accept strict limits on Western military assistance, and, in practice, accept that it will not join NATO or receive meaningful security guarantees. From Moscow's point of view, this would mean they get all of their principal demands. Figures in Washington like Marco Rubio may, in their hearts, want peace, but they want peace on Ukraine's terms or on the neoconservative terms long pushed by people like Victoria Nuland. Rubio is a hawk, but the facts are what they are. The Ukrainians are losing, and there is nothing that can be done to reverse the fundamental trajectory. Donald Trump, not Rubio, is the president, and Trump wants to cut a deal. He recognizes that Ukraine can't win, that Russia is winning, and that they are about to knock out the Ukrainians. Ukraine is on the ropes. Whether the war drags on another month or two doesn't change the fundamental reality that Kyiv cannot sustain this conflict indefinitely. Trump is recognizing that reality and has sent people like Steve Witkoff, not Rubio, to talk to the Russians. Meanwhile, superhawks like Keith Kellogg, seeing the proposal on the table and realizing they've lost, are stepping down. Let me briefly shift to Gaza. Since I last reflected on this, the UN Security Council has given its blessing to a Donald Trump, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner peace plan. The Israelis are ecstatic, to the point where their ambassador at the UN was physically hugging the American ambassador after the vote. Why are the Israelis so pleased? Probably because they essentially wrote the plan and because it's ideal from their point of view. This UN resolution, which incorporates President Trump's 20-point plan for Gaza, is, in my view, a travesty. It's disgraceful. For the Palestinians, there is no genuine self-determination in it. They are not getting a real state of their own, nor any meaningful say in how Gaza will be administered. Instead, the entities effectively in charge will be the United States and Israel, the same tag team that has been perpetrating what many describe as genocide since October 2023. So the plan puts the two principal perpetrators in charge and creates a board of peace that will be the supreme decision maker in Gaza, headed by Donald Trump himself. There is talk of an international stabilization force, but I doubt such a force will ever deploy as advertised because Hamas has said it will not disarm. It's hard to imagine a multinational force going in with the primary mission of disarming Hamas and doing Israel's dirty work for it. The plan makes little sense as a genuine peace arrangement. I am shocked that this resolution was not vetoed by Russia and China, and equally shocked that it was enthusiastically supported by so many Arab and Islamic countries, given the extent to which Palestinians are being sacrificed after years of suffering and 2 years of genocidal destruction. You would think Arab and Muslim leaders would have opposed this resolution and sought a new one that offered real self-determination and a meaningful political horizon for the Palestinians, something the Russians themselves said they wanted. That did not happen. On Israel and Iran, let me address a particularly disturbing dynamic. There are credible claims that Israel has privately warned U.S. presidents that if the United States does not bomb Iranian nuclear facilities, Israel will use nuclear weapons itself. Whether that specific conversation happened exactly as reported or not, the logic is completely believable. Israel's leadership firmly believes that Iran, armed with nuclear weapons, would be an existential threat. They see enrichment facilities as the beginning of that capability. They also know they cannot reliably destroy deeply buried Iranian sites with their current conventional arsenal. They do not have the heavy bunker-busting bombs or the capacity to strike as we did, for example, on June 22 of this past year. If they conclude that they cannot remove what they see as an existential threat with conventional weapons, but might do so with small nuclear weapons, the temptation is obvious. If there were solid evidence that Iran was actually acquiring nuclear weapons and Israel lacked a conventional military solution, I think the chances that Israel would seriously consider using nuclear weapons are high. They view this as another possible Holocaust scenario. When Israel believes its survival is at stake, restraint is not a concept that has much practical meaning. The danger is heightened by the fact that Iran does not have nuclear weapons, so it cannot retaliate in kind. No other nuclear power will come to Iran's defense with its own arsenal. That asymmetry is precisely what makes this scenario so dangerous. It's analogous in some ways to my earlier fear during the first year of the Ukraine war, that Russia might turn to nuclear weapons if things went very badly at the conventional level, because Ukraine had no nuclear deterrent of its own. Does the United States have leverage over Israel on this nuclear question? In theory, we should. In practice, we rarely have meaningful leverage over Israel at all. And if Israeli leaders truly believe they face an existential threat, whatever leverage we normally have tends to evaporate. When a state's leadership is convinced that its survival is on the line, it will act unilaterally, regardless of outside pressure. All of this, the erosion of legal constraints on power at home, the willingness to overthrow governments abroad, the nuclear brinkmanship in multiple theaters, and the stubborn refusal to accept uncomfortable realities on the battlefield fits together. It is part of a broader pattern in which Washington claims the right to reshape the world, ignores sovereignty, and then acts shocked when the costs, constraints, and blowback become impossible to ignore. You have the U.S. trying to twist everything, casting Russia as the side that refuses dialogue. Yet on the very same day, we're getting the Axios story about the Trump administration trying to push a 28-point plan onto Russia with big questions about what exactly is in those 28 points. Washington is in this position where it might finally be waking up to reality just a little bit, even if it won't admit it openly. Meanwhile, Moscow has been rooted in reality the entire time. They knew what they were getting into with this war and with the escalation pressures from NATO right on their doorstep. And still, they're willing to talk with people like us in other countries who have our own audiences, hoping the message gets out somewhere, since it certainly won't be carried honestly by the mainstream media. That same mainstream media repeats the lies on loop. Russia says something, and immediately the press turns to Zelensky and treats whatever he says as holy writ. People who haven't woken up yet are going to have a rough shock when they're finally forced to confront that things are falling apart for Kyiv on the battlefield and inside Zelensky's inner circle with this latest corruption investigation and everything that comes with it. They're going to say, wait, I thought Kyiv was winning. I thought Russian and Ukrainian losses were about the same. And they'll discover that none of that was true. They were being lied to again, just as they've been lied to over and over in previous wars. There's another angle here, the format of that Zakharova event. Western governments would never allow people like us into that sort of setting with a senior official without pre-vetting every question. They certainly wouldn't let us go in cold, live with no idea what we were going to ask. Meanwhile, Western outlets like the BBC, Sky, CNN get physically close to President Putin and can, in principle, ask him anything, while Russian journalists are effectively banned from even setting foot in places like Britain. That asymmetry tells you a lot about who's actually more open. Now, the other big question is, how are Western governments and media going to explain this war when it ends with a Russian triumph, whether through some 28-point deal or simply by military collapse on the Ukrainian side? They have spent nearly 3 years telling us that Ukraine was winning, that Russia was just a gas station with rockets, that Russia was so desperate it was stripping washing machines for missile components, that Putin was sick, dying, or already dead, that the Russian army was on the verge of mutiny. How do you square all that propaganda with what is shaping up, by any serious metric, to be a major Ukrainian defeat? This is the multi-billion-dollar question. I'll give Trump one thing. He is a spin master for his own base. When he decides on a course, say attacking the Houthis in Yemen, he charges in as if no lessons were learned from years of helping the Saudis bomb that country into what was once the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The Trump team learned quickly that the Houthis weren't going to back down. So what did Trump do? He cut a deal with them, then tried to sell it to the public as if they had capitulated. Anyone paying close attention knew that wasn't the case, but Trump counted on the majority not paying close attention. We're seeing the same pattern with the Epstein files. Trump promised that under him the truth would come out, that the public would see what really happened. Once in office, he started walking that back. Now we're getting a heavily redacted version with a national security excuse used to black out the most sensitive pieces, including ties to Israel and the broader blackmail operations that were likely involved. Then he'll turn to his base and say, look, I kept my promise. Everything's out in the open. So when I look at what the Trump administration is doing with Ukraine, I see a similar setup. This 28-point plan feels like a prepackaged narrative to let Trump declare, the war is over, I fixed it. Just like he has tried to frame Gaza ignoring genocide, ignoring the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians killed with direct U.S. Support, and pretending he solved it by blessing an arrangement that supposedly gets rid of Hamas. In reality, he's letting Israel rebrand occupation and control as peace. I can easily see Trump trying to do a version of this with Ukraine. If he can get Russia to agree to any deal, he will spin it to his base as the U.S. won. We forced peace. We were the fair mediator, despite the fact that Washington has been a direct party to the conflict from day one. So in the coming days and weeks, the real thing to watch is not what Trump says, but what Russia is actually willing to agree to. Russia has been crystal clear about its demands since 2022, especially after the referendums later that year. They want the 4 additional regions plus Crimea, part of Russia now for over a decade, formally recognized as Russian territory. They want guarantees that there will be no repeat of this war, that NATO will leave Ukraine alone, no membership, no missiles on their border. My skepticism comes from this simple reality. It's not obvious NATO can leave Kyiv alone. Even if they sign a paper saying they will, their track record, Minsk I, Minsk II, every broken promise since the 1,990 seconds shows they can't be trusted. So I'm cynical about any guarantees written into a Trump peace deal. The war itself has also been misunderstood. NATO expected to weaken Russia economically and militarily, maybe even bring it to its knees. They thought sanctions would wreck Russia's economy, that Moscow would be forced to accept NATO on its doorstep, even nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory. The opposite happened. Russia chose a war of attrition, focused on grinding down the Ukrainian military rather than dramatic territorial lunges. They could have decapitated Kyiv in a day, hitting Zelensky and his top people, turning the capital into chaos. They chose instead to break the military machine that NATO had built. That's what we're seeing now. Western media likes to harp on territory, saying Russia hasn't gained much land this year, as if that proves Moscow is stuck. but territorial lines miss the point. In an attrition strategy, the key metric is destroyed manpower, materiel, infrastructure, and the opponent's ability to regenerate. And that is exactly where Kyiv is bleeding out. Now that Russia is making visible advances again, suddenly we're hearing, well, that town isn't really important, or that transport hub doesn't really matter. A few months ago, those same places were described as strategically vital. The narrative is breaking. NATO elites are starting to sense it. This is not going well for Kyiv. At the same time, you have NABU, the Anti-Corruption Bureau, originally set up and backed by the U.S. after the 2014 coup, going after Zelensky's inner circle. That's not an accident. When that's installed structure begins targeting the very people Washington built up, it's a signal, we're done with you, your time is almost up. Right now, remarkably, the entire top Ukrainian leadership is out of the country. 2 are in hiding from anti-corruption investigators, 1 in Israel, another in Turkey. One of them even received Zelensky in Turkey today, but has made clear he's not coming back because he knows he's in NABU's crosshairs. Reliable observers are openly predicting that the head of Zelensky's presidential office has maybe 72 hours before arrest and fall from grace. The wave of investigations is moving steadily closer to Zelensky himself. It's hard to believe that all his top people were stealing hundreds of millions in Western taxpayer money, and he knew nothing about it. Of course he knew. Just a few years ago, Western media told us Zelensky was fighting corruption, bravely cleaning house. In reality, he was just silencing dissent and eliminating rivals. And like every U.S. puppet before him, his shelf life was always limited. When Washington is done with you, the end is rarely pretty. Maybe Zelensky dreams of a condo in Miami. I wouldn't be surprised if things end much darker than that. The crucial point, NABU itself was a U.S. project. So if it's now cutting into Zelensky's inner circle, it means Washington is at least tacitly on board. It's a message. Your usefulness is over. We're preparing the next puppet. Yes, there will be a next puppet. Maybe they drag Valery Zaluzhny back and try to rehabilitate him. Maybe they dust off Petro Poroshenko or invent a new face entirely. But whoever it is, as long as NATO is calling the shots, that person will be another proxy, another figurehead for the same project. Any sham election under these conditions will be illegitimate from Russia's perspective and frankly, from any honest legal perspective. Everything we've seen from NATO and the Trump team so far points to a Minsk III style arrangement. Heavy on vague security guarantees for Ukraine, talk of peacekeeping forces on Ukrainian soil, which in practice would be foreign troops and infrastructure entrenching NATO's presence under a different label. That's what Russia has to watch for at the negotiating table. From where I sit, Russia holds most of the cards now. NATO cannot change the battlefield dynamics without openly entering the war at scale, and that would mean flirting with full-on nuclear escalation, a step no sane Western leader wants to be responsible for. Tomahawks and isolated deep strikes won't change the overall balance. Only nuclear war would, and that's a line they are terrified to cross. So the big questions now are, how far will Washington go in dumping Zelensky and recasting the narrative? What terms will Russia actually insist on, knowing its leverage? And how much of this will Trump try to spin as an American victory, even as the rest of the world sees it for what it is, a Russian victory over a NATO project in Ukraine? Whatever face they put on it, that outcome will be a tectonic event. A Russian victory over NATO's proxy will supercharge BRICS, the SCO, and the broader multipolar shift. It will prove decisively that sanctions, narrative management, and proxy wars are no longer enough to maintain Western hegemony. And that, whether Washington admits it or not, is the new reality.